For an entire generation of Americans, it was the signal that the week's best hour of television was over. A simple wave and a heartfelt, "Good night and may God bless." It was the signature of Red Skelton, America's favorite clown. His cast of lovable goofballs, from the dim-witted country bumpkin Clem Cadiddlehopper to the silent, soulful hobo Freddie the Freeloader, felt like part of the family. Week after week, he was a comforting, constant presence on the airwaves, a man whose entire purpose seemed to be making people happy. His humor was clean, his characters were timeless, and his connection with the audience was absolute. He was, in every sense of the word, America's Clown Prince, a title he earned over a career that stretched from dusty medicine show stages to the brightest lights of Hollywood. For 20 years, Red Skelton was America's goofy, lovable clown. He played the innocent kid and the silly drunk, bringing pure joy to millions. But the people who worked with him side stage knew a different man. Behind that painted smile, he was hiding a grief that would have destroyed most people. The truth. Behind America's favorite funny man was darker than anyone could have imagined. He was the son of a clown who died before he was born, a kid who battled a level of poverty that would scar him for life, and a man who would face a personal tragedy so devastating it cast a shadow over everything he did. The laughter he gave, the world was his shield, and the smile he wore was a masterpiece of misdirection. This is the story of the man behind the makeup, a story of unimaginable sorrow that Red Skelton hid from the world that adored him. To really understand the man, who became a symbol of laughter, you have to go back to the beginning, to a place where joy was hard to come by. Richard Bernard Skelton was born on July 18, 1913, in Vincennes, Indiana, and his life was marked by loss from the very start. His father, Joseph Skelton, a former circus clown who had become a grocer, died just 2 months before his youngest son was born. The man whose own son would become one of the most famous clowns in history never even got to meet him. It was as if this paternal ghost, this inherited legacy of grease paint and performance, hung over Red's life, a destiny he seemed born to fulfill, yet one that started with an absence. With Joseph gone, the Skelton family was plunged into extreme poverty. His mother, Ida, worked as a cleaning woman, struggling to support her 4 boys. A childhood friend later said the family was so poor they didn't have a pot to pee in or a window to throw it out of. This wasn't just a tough childhood. It was a daily fight for survival. By the time he was 7, little Red was already working, slinging newspapers on the street to help his family get by. It was the kind of life that forces a boy to grow up fast, to learn how to hustle, and to understand the power of a smile, even when you have nothing to smile about. The real turning point came in 1923. As the story goes, a 10-year-old Red was selling his papers outside a local theater when a well-dressed man bought every single one he had. That man was the famous comedian Ed Wynn. Wynn didn't just buy the papers. He took the boy backstage, showed him the lights, the performers, and the audience from the other side of the curtain. For a poor kid from Indiana, it was like landing on another planet, seeing the magic of show business, and hearing that sound of laughter. Red knew right then and there what he was meant to do. After that, the classroom couldn't hold him. He had a restless spirit and a family to feed. By the time he was a young teenager, Red had quit school and hit the road, becoming a full-time entertainer before he was even old enough to vote. His early career was a masterclass in the gritty underbelly of American entertainment. He worked medicine shows, telling jokes to draw crowds for miracle tonics. He performed on showboats, in rowdy burlesque houses, in minstrel shows, and even spent time in the circus, just like his father. This wasn't a glamorous life. It was a grind of constant travel, terrible pay, and tough crowds. But it was also the perfect training ground. It's where he perfected his pantomime, developed that rubber-faced expressiveness, and learned how to win over any audience. He learned that to survive, you had to be tough, you had to be versatile, and you had to connect with people. The poverty of his youth gave him an empathy for the common person that would make his characters so beloved later on. The hardship of the road forged an iron will and a desperate need to perform, to escape the pain of his past by creating joy in the present. These were the experiences that built Red Skelton, the entertainer. But they were also the cracks in the foundation, the early sorrows that would one day be joined by unimaginable tragedy. In the rough-and-tumble world of 1930s showbiz, talent alone wasn't enough. You needed grit, business savvy, and a relentless drive. In 1931, a 17-year-old Red Skelton was working as an MC at grueling dance marathons when he met a 16-year-old usherette named Edna Stillwell. She came up to him after a show and told him, point blank, that his jokes weren't very good. Red shot back, "You write 'em, I'll say 'em." And with that, one of the most formidable partnerships in entertainment history was born. They married soon after, a team of two ambitious kids determined to claw their way to the top. Edna was so much more than just Red's wife. She was the architect of his career. Red had the raw, chaotic talent, but Edna had the focus, the discipline, and a brilliant mind for business. She became his manager and chief writer, the steady hand that guided him. When a boss tried to cut Red's salary, it was Edna who stormed in and not only got the money back, but negotiated a raise. Knowing he'd left school early, she bought him textbooks and helped him earn a high school equivalency degree. Together, they polished his act. They developed what would become his signature routine, the donut dunkers. It was a masterpiece of pantomime where Red acted out all the different ways people dunk their donuts, from the dainty and polite to the slobbish and absurd. The sketch was a sensation, a perfect showcase of his physical comedy that didn't need a single spoken word. It was a routine they created together, and it became his ticket to the big time. By the late 1930s, all their hard work started paying off. In 1937, Red got a huge break with a guest spot on Rudy Valley's wildly popular radio show. The national audience fell in love with him. His wacky blend of sound effects, character voices, and childlike innocence was perfect for radio. That appearance opened doors, and in 1938, he landed his own radio program, Avalon Time, with Edna right there on the cast and writing staff. Soon enough, Hollywood came knocking. MGM, the biggest studio in town, signed him to a movie contract. In 1938, he was soon starring alongside legends like Ginger Rogers. By 1941, he was the star of his own smash hit radio show, the Raleigh Cigarette Program, where he introduced the world to characters who would become household names. There was Cauliflower McPug, the punch-drunk boxer, Willie Lump Lump, the happy drunk, and of course, Junior, the mean Whittle kid, whose catchphrase, "I doed it," swept the nation. On the surface, it was the American dream. The poor kid from Indiana was now a movie star and a radio king. But behind the scenes, the partnership that made it all happen was falling apart. The insane pressure of his career had destroyed his marriage to Edna. They divorced in 1943, but in a move that completely baffled Hollywood, their professional partnership continued. Edna remained his manager and writer for nearly a decade after they split, earning a massive salary. It was a strange arrangement that spoke volumes about their deep, complicated bond. Edna had built the Red Skelton empire, and even after their love was gone, she wasn't about to let it crumble. As Red Skelton's star was rising in Hollywood, the world was falling into the chaos of World War II. In 1944, after his divorce from Edna, Red lost his married man draft deferment and was inducted into the U.S. Army as a private. His studio and radio sponsor fought to keep him home, arguing he was more valuable as an entertainer. But the Army didn't care. He was shipped overseas to serve in an entertainment unit, a role that sounded safe but would push him to his absolute limit. The demand on him was crushing. He was expected to be on constantly, performing as many as a dozen shows a day for troops in Europe, on top of his regular duties as a soldier. The constant performing, the lack of sleep, and the emotional weight of entertaining men who were facing death every day started to break him down. Finally, in Italy, the pressure became too much. Red Skelton, America's funny man, suffered a complete nervous breakdown. He spent 3 months in an army hospital, a dark period he almost never spoke about later. He was discharged in September 1945, returning to America with invisible scars. He'd often joke about it, saying, "I was the only celebrity who went in and came out a private," a classic one-liner to hide the very real trauma he'd been through. He came back a different man, but his career was a runaway train. Just before shipping out, he had met a beautiful former model named Georgia Maureen Davis. Their romance was a whirlwind, and they married on March 9, 1945. For Red, it felt like a new beginning, a chance to have the happy family life he projected to the world. They soon had 2 children, a daughter, Valentina, born in 1947, and a son, Richard, born a year later. His career exploded all over again. He went back to radio, and in 1951, he made the leap to the brand new medium of television. The Red Skelton show was an immediate smash hit. It was the perfect format for his physical side. The public knew the boy was sick, and the entire nation that loved Red Skelton watched on with a heavy heart. For Red, the emotional toll was unimaginable. His entire life was built on making people laugh, on projecting an image of pure joy. Now he had to walk into a studio every week, put on the clown makeup, and perform silly characters for a live audience, all while knowing his son was dying. He would spend his days at the hospital watching Richard endure painful treatments, then drive to CBS to rehearse pratfalls. It was a kind of psychological torture, walking a tightrope between the deepest private agony and the most public, joyful performance. The end came on May 10, 1958. The story of that day has become a Hollywood legend, a grim example of the old showbiz rule. The show must go on. Some accounts claim Red was at the studio for a rehearsal when he got the call that his son was fading fast. He reportedly went on stage, did his job flawlessly, and only allowed himself to collapse in grief after the cameras were off. Whether the timing was that precise or not, the truth remains. He kept working, fulfilling his duty to his audience, while his own heart was breaking into 1,000,000 pieces. Richard passed away at UCLA Medical Center just 10 days before his 10th birthday. The details are almost too painful to hear. Knowing his birthday was near, Red had brought a Sears catalog to the hospital so Richard could pick out his presents. The boy chose a tent and some camping gear, but his last thoughts were for his mother. Pointing to a red blanket, he asked, "Daddy, will you get Mama that red blanket for Mother's Day?" Richard's death sent Red into a deep, dark depression that never really left him. A friend who visited the family's Bel Air mansion shortly after said he found a man who was completely hollowed out by grief. The house was dead silent. For a long time, Red would go into Richard's bedroom, which was left untouched, and just sit for hours among his son's toys and model trains, surrounded by the memory of the boy he had lost. And yet, he never stopped working. He went back to his show, back to the grind of making America laugh. It was his only way to cope. He once famously said that clowns were lucky, because they could be crying on the inside and no one would ever know, since the makeup wouldn't smear. He was talking about himself. The laughter was now his mask. The joy he brought to millions was now born from the deepest sorrow. The loss of his son was the central tragedy of Red Skelton's life, a wound that would never heal, a private grief he carried for the rest of his life, hidden just behind the painted smile. Losing a child can put an unbearable strain on a marriage. And for Red and Georgia Skelton, the death of their son Richard was a trauma that ultimately drove them apart. The grief that hung over their Bel Air mansion was a constant silent poison that ruined the years that followed. While Red buried himself in his work, using the relentless schedule of his TV show as a shield, Georgia had no such escape. She was left alone in that huge, quiet house, haunted by the memories of the life they once had. The immense pressure of being married to one of America's biggest stars, combined with her crippling grief, took a devastating toll. She began to struggle with severe depression and a dependency on alcohol, trying to numb a pain that was just too great to bear. The family's private turmoil exploded into the public eye in 1966, when news broke that Georgia had suffered a gunshot wound. The official story was that it was an accident, but in Hollywood, the whispers said it had been a suicide attempt, a desperate cry for help from a woman who was drowning in sorrow. The cracks in their marriage finally shattered. The shared grief that should have bonded them instead became a wedge that pushed them into their own lonely worlds of pain. In 1971, after 26 years of marriage, Red and Georgia divorced. The proceedings were messy and public, further damaging the wholesome family man image Red had built for decades. But the divorce didn't free Georgia. Her life was still chained to the tragedies of her past. The darkness that had followed her for so long finally consumed her on a day of horrific, tragic significance. On May 10, 1976, what would have been the 18th anniversary of her son Richard's death, Georgia Skelton took her own life. It was a final, heartbreaking act that proved just how deep and unending her grief was. Her death was a devastating end to the family's story, a confirmation that the loss of their son had ultimately claimed two victims. For Red, it was another crushing blow. Even though they were divorced, Georgia was the mother of his children, his partner during his rise to fame, and the person who shared his greatest sorrow. Her suicide just added another layer of tragedy to a life already full of it. The laughter he produced on screen now seemed less like entertainment and more like an act of desperate defiance against the overwhelming sadness of his own life. The world knew Red Skelton as the goofy king of clean comedy, but there was a whole other side to him that the television cameras never saw. Away from the studio lights, Red was a serious and prolific artist who channeled his complicated emotions not just into his characters, but onto canvas, into music, and onto the written page. His most famous hidden talent was painting. For years, it was just a private hobby, an outlet for the feelings he couldn't express with a pratfall or a silly voice. And what did he paint? Clowns. But these weren't the happy-go-lucky clowns from his TV show. Skelton's painted clowns were often sad, thoughtful, and soulful, their eyes hinting at a deep well of emotion behind the makeup. In many ways, they were self-portraits of his own inner world. He kept his art private for a long time, but in 1964, his wife Georgia finally convinced him to display some of his paintings at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. The public response was incredible. People were fascinated by this hidden side of their favorite comedian, and collectors were instantly hooked. What started as a private passion quickly turned into an astonishingly successful second career. His original paintings sold for tens of thousands of dollars, and he later sold prints and lithographs that earned him a fortune. His art became a massive commercial enterprise, but his creativity didn't stop there. He was also a prolific composer, writing thousands of pieces of music from background scores to patriotic marches like his Red's White and Blue March. And on top of all that, he was a dedicated writer. It's said that toward the end of his life, he made it a daily ritual to write one short story every single day, which he would then collect and self-publish. These hidden talents reveal a man far more complex than his public image ever let on. The guy who played the fool for the camera was, in private, a multi-talented and deeply thoughtful artist. His painting, composing, and writing weren't just hobbies. They were how he processed the world. They were the outlets for his sorrow and his quiet observations on life, seen through the unique, bittersweet eyes of a clown. After so much personal tragedy, the last decades of Red Skelton's life were about finding some peace and slowly stepping away from the spotlight that had both made him and tormented him. In 1973, he married for a third and final time to Lothian Toland. She brought a sense of quiet stability to his life, and their marriage would last until his death. Professionally, however, the world was changing. In 1970, even though his show was still a top 10 hit, CBS just canceled it. The network was. In the middle of what was later called the Rural Purge, a strategy to get rid of shows that appealed to older, more rural viewers, to make room for programming aimed at younger city audiences. Skelton, along with shows like The Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres, was suddenly considered old-fashioned. He was completely heartbroken, feeling betrayed by the network he had helped build for 16 years. He tried one last season at NBC, in a shorter format, but the magic wasn't quite the same, and the show was canceled in 1971. His incredible 20-year run on network television was over. For years, he remained bitter about it, feeling that the networks had turned their backs on the very heartland audience that made them successful in the first place. But Red Skelton was a performer to his core. He couldn't just stop. So he went back to his roots, touring the country and performing live for sold-out crowds in theaters and casinos. He proved that his bond with the audience was as strong as ever, often performing for 2 hours straight. It was his way of showing the network executives they were wrong, and that his brand of clean, heartfelt humor was still wanted. Red Skelton passed away from pneumonia on September 17, 1997, at the age of 84. He was laid to rest in the family tomb at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, right alongside his son Richard and his second wife Georgia, reuniting in death the family that had been so shattered in life. His legacy is complicated. For generations of Americans, he will always be the ultimate clown, a symbol of innocent fun. His characters are a part of our cultural memory, and his gentle sign-off, "Good night and may God bless," still feels warm and sincere. But his life story tells us something deeper. It's a powerful reminder that the people who make us laugh the loudest are often carrying the heaviest burdens. He was a comedic genius who brought joy to millions, but he was also a man who endured poverty, war trauma, the unspeakable grief of losing a child, and the tragic death of his former wife. The laughter was his refuge and his mask, a beautiful facade that hid a lifetime of sorrow. Red Skelton made America laugh, and we'll always remember him for that. But his true story is one of incredible